All right, so I will get us started now. And I'm going to continue where we left off last week. And this is in this series of lectures on deranged democracy that is really looking at the philosophical and historical roots of modern democracy in order to ask about the assumptions, the philosophical assumptions, the maybe anthropological and psychological assumptions about human nature that went into the revival of an ancient idea, the idea of democracy in Europe and then in other parts of the world in the 18th and 19th centuries, leading to revolutions and constitution writing and the massive reorganization of politics, with more and more people given the franchise, modern political parties emerging, competitive elections, and now all the stuff that we take for granted in the kind of three-ring circus surrounding modern electoral politics. And my reason for starting with that history is to try to get as much clarity as possible about those assumptions about human nature, to then scrutinize them. And if we conclude that things are perhaps not exactly what
Sorry, David, I actually muted everybody.
Yes.
Unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
And so we lost like 5 or 10 seconds, right? And that gives me a chance to note that Bob had something in the chat, I thought. No? Bob, did you try to raise an issue?
Well, I didn't have anything in the chat, but I did have a question or a comment. That is,
go ahead.
That is, I don't or can't understand Kant, and I hope you go over his philosophy again today.
Okay. It was not my intention to, but maybe I'll spend a couple minutes trying to review some of what we covered last week, at least in terms of the essential conclusions. So thanks for letting me know, Bob. And that's a great way to use the questions, is to say, wait a sec, this stuff is detailed and intricate and complex, and we need a little bit more time on it. Oh, I can also see now that people are on the 8th floor. That's great. I'm glad to see you guys are able to get back together again. Let me continue where we left off just a moment ago. And so I was saying, I want us to get as clear as possible about the philosophical, anthropological, psychological presuppositions of modern democracy, what the Enlightenment thinkers thought they could rely on in terms of reviving popular politics in a modern, commercial, large-scale society. And to do that in order to really then be able to question those assumptions on the basis of more recent work in psychology, psychiatry, cognitive science, collective behavior as well, to see if some of the craziness we're seeing in contemporary politics might not be traceable to the fact that the institutions we have assume things that aren't true, or maybe, to put it a little bit more historically, no longer hold for the humans who are voting and debating and running for office and exercising political power. And so that's the big project of the lecture series. Today, I'm going to really focus on modern democracy and its theory. And as the painting perhaps makes clear, I'm talking about the revival of an ancient idea. I frankly don't think it's a particularly great painting, but I think it's in a sense an interesting painting. It's by Philipp von Foltz, who is German, painting it in the middle of the 19th century. But what he's painting is Pericles' famous funeral oration, which contained, I think that contains really the most elaborate defense of Athenian democracy that comes down to us through the ages. And the issue is, of course, that here's a German historical painter in the middle of the 19th century returning to themes from 2000 plus years earlier, because there's a renewed interest in democracy in all of Europe. And there is this sense that what the Greeks had, we're not going to exactly recreate. We don't want a city state. We don't want participatory democracy. We don't want to draw lots to determine who's going to govern us. But the core idea of popular sovereignty is one we do want to revive, even if we're going to institutionalize it in different ways and understand it in different ways. We are returning, in a sense, to Athenian democracy in the 18th and 19th century as a model for how to organize modern politics. And so how is it that the Enlightenment led eventually into this revival of the idea of democracy? That is the big project. And again, you will notice, if you're paying careful attention, that I've shifted from calling it week to topic, that I've got 6 topics. We're a little bit behind schedule. That's entirely my fault. There's always more to talk about. But I do want to cover each of these topics in sufficient detail. And so we're kind of transitioning between the second and the third topic at this point. And Bob asked about Kant. And so let's just remember that, in a sense, I've been trying to reconstruct the philosophical debates that we now retroactively group together as the debates of Enlightenment philosophy, kind of as a tennis match in which Descartes serves the ball of modern philosophy, and then it's returned again and again and again, hit back and forth. And each time the next thinker responds to the previous thinker. And of course, they're not purely reacting. They're each creating their own philosophical systems, but they are in part responding to the previous generation, the previous most significant text that comes to them. And they are, in so doing, advancing the ideas that we come eventually to call Enlightenment ideas. And so with that in mind, we've gone through Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Smith, and Kant. And Bob has asked us to revisit Kant a little bit. I was not planning on doing that in detail, but let me just point out some central conclusions and then try to relate them back to the philosophical foundations on which they rest, and then see if there are other questions that you want to address. And so Kant, in his own words, his own conception, is a critical philosopher. And what that means is that no aspect of human knowledge, human culture, human institutions, human authority can be exempted from the critique of reason. Everything has to be able to prove itself at the bar of reason, or as Kant put it, the tribunal of reason. That means we have to be able to examine the presuppositions of any claim to knowledge, authority, greatness, beauty, and ask, are we convinced on the basis of the argument that can be made for those claims? Can those claims be validated in the court of pure reason? And this leads Kant then to turn reason, quote, in upon itself, and to examine how the mind is structured. What are the categories of the understanding? What are the other faculties of the mind? How does the imagination work? If reason has, if you will, 2 core functions, one of which is about understanding the world and the things in it. The other of which is practical reason. So the first you might call empirical reason, the second practical reason. And if practical reason is reason directed at the question, what should we do? How should I lead my life? What do I owe to others? What do I have to do in order to be just? In the same way that the mind, the reason can turn itself in on the mind and discover that we couldn't make sense of the world. We couldn't live in the world. We couldn't get about our business in the world if we didn't, for instance, use the category of causation to understand the world. And so although, and this is Kant's reply to Hume's challenge, right? That tennis ball has been served hard and fast by David Hume from Scotland, and Kant is trying to return it in Germany. He's saying back to Hume, we can be confident that the world will continue to obey the principle of causation, not because we can locate in the world the causal connection between the two events that are, quote, constantly conjoined in our experience, but because we couldn't make sense of the world without the principle of causation. We are imposing that understanding on the world, and we have to impose that understanding on the world, and therefore we will be always confident that causation will be part of the way in which we experience the world. Our structuring categories are necessary and can be seen through reason's self-examination, not requiring us to penetrate into the actual nature of causation out there in the universe. And so that's one aspect of Kant's inquiry in his critique of pure reason, but he also does a moral and a political project where he turns reason in upon itself again, but this time he asks, how do we decide moral, ethical, political issues? And can reason govern us on the basis of its own power, both to tell us what to do and to motivate us to do the right thing? And there Kant suggests, yes, we can. And the answer that we surveyed together last week is Kant's account of the categorical imperative. And I don't have the slide, I'll have to do this more casually, but what Kant suggests is that when we use reason to ask, how should I act? Reason tells us a few different things, but they are all essentially equivalent to each other. If I'm deciding what I should do, I should ask myself, could I will that to be a universal rule, that anyone in a situation similar to mine would do the same thing? And if I try to perform that test and I determine if everybody acted the way that I'm tempted to act in this situation, it would be destructive or chaotic or anarchical. If the example that's often used is if you were to tell a lie when it's convenient to you to do so, when it's in your interest to do so, well, you might get away with it because generally speaking, everybody tells the truth. And so the background assumption is that you're telling the truth. But if everybody followed your example and also told lies whenever it was convenient, the entire fabric of truthfulness on which all of our social interaction relies would disintegrate. And we would be, again, unable to navigate the world, at this point, the social world, as opposed to the natural world. And what Kant is in essence saying with that universal law formulation of the categorical imperative is that you cannot treat yourself as special. You are just one among many equal people, each of whom loves themselves, but is also equipped with reason. And therefore, if you do not follow universal principles and laws, if you exempt yourself from what you expect everybody else to do, you are guilty of a kind of egoism and also of a violation of the core idea of human equality. You're treating yourself implicitly as if you are better than everyone else. So, all of that to say, Kant develops this moral philosophy that turns reason in upon itself, detects these categorical imperatives. Other formulations of the categorical imperative include the formulation of humanity as an end in itself. Always treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, never exclusively as a means, but always also as an end, right? And so recognize that every human being treats themselves as intrinsically important, intrinsically dignified, not merely a means to other people's ends, but as a locus of their own purposes, their own ends, which make their lives worth living. You may at points need the help, assistance of other people. It may be a simple transaction. You're handing the teller at the grocery store your money and purchasing your groceries, but the fact that you're using them to accomplish your purpose does not justify you in treating them only as a means. You have to, and Kant does not, in the original formulation of the categorical imperative, tell us what it means to treat every person as a locus of dignity and as the center of their own life. But we have to figure out what is required. And then Kant finally says, one more formulation of the categorical imperative. I'm going back over this because Bob asked me to. In politics and in social life more broadly, you should act as if your will was going to make a law for a kingdom of ends, a society in which every person is treated as an end in themselves. What would such a society be like? Act as if you're already in it. And Kant is suggesting, in a sense, that you cannot control your world, right? You may not live in a society that affords equal dignity to all persons, but what you can control is your own conduct in that world. And therefore, you should act as if you already belong to the world that you aspire to inhabit, the world that is perfectly just, and treat everybody in accordance with the way everybody would be treated in that world. And again, to get the status of this clear, Kant doesn't think this is his own moral system. Kant believes that this is the dictates of human reason as such, if we are only willing to examine it and figure out what it means to be governed by a good will, to do duty for the sake of doing duty. Reason will tell us, and reason has this form. Now, having said all of that, this then gives us certain political principles as well. And I've put on the board the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, and then there's further texts, the critique of practical reason, the Metaphysics of Morals itself, in which Kant develops his full moral and political philosophy, again, to present a highly distilled and simplified version of this. Kant says, first, that there's only one system of government that is compatible with each human status as an end in his or herself. We are all intrinsically important and dignified, and we all have a universal capacity for autonomy, for governing ourselves by our own reason. That form of government is a form of government in which individuals either author or consent to the laws they obey. And I want you to note, and we're about to go into the details of this, and I'll express it this way. There's a famous story about Kant. Kant never left the provincial capital. he grew up in. He spent his whole life in a very narrow place in Königsberg, Germany. And he basically, in his adult life, never missed his walk. And the joke in Königsberg is you could set your watch by Kant's walk. He was a highly regulated person. He took his walk the same course, the same time every day, except for 2 occasions. And one of those occasions was when the newspaper announced that the French Revolution had begun, and Kant was so engrossed in reading about it that he forgot to go on his walk. The other was when Rousseau's Emile arrived in the mail, and he got so engrossed in it that he forgot to take his walk. And so there's very strong echoes of Rousseau in this idea that you've got to respect the autonomy of the individual, and that is the core requirement of political legitimacy. And we're going to get there in just a few minutes in terms of more detail on Rousseau. Before we get there, let's conclude the discussion of Kant. And I want to point out that what this means, a form of government in which individuals either author or at least consent to the laws they obey, is that this will be a Republican form of government, right? What we would call a democracy, Kant in his era calls a Republican form of government. And the idea of republicanism requires a law-based state, a Rechtsstaat, and that includes not only the idea that all political power will be exercised in accordance with the law. It won't be decrees. It won't be just the prince telling us what to do, but laws enacted according to procedures themselves that are regulated by law, and with individuals only having the authority granted or invested in them by the law. And on Kant's account, the law-based state includes robust private rights to do what you want to do in your sphere of autonomy. That includes liberty of conscience and religion, property as setting up a kind of inviolable domestic sphere, as long as you're obeying the law within the domestic sphere, and the right to association as well. And that is necessary to respect the status of citizens as ends in themselves. And so one of the things to note, Benjamin Constant contrasted the liberty of the ancients with the liberty of the moderns. I'm talking today about reviving an ancient idea on modern foundations. The ancients famously put Socrates to death for exercising his liberty of conscience, right? They didn't believe in private rights restraining public right. Kant and modern democracy are different in this regard, in that they say there's certain things the majority cannot do because it would violate the equality or the dignity of certain citizens. Putting someone to death for their religious beliefs or their philosophical beliefs is among those things that a modern republic cannot do. He also argued, this is kind of a reconstruction of Kant, but I think it's an accurate reconstruction of his philosophy of history, that although modern republicanism is the only legitimate form of government, it does not work always and everywhere, that it requires to be met halfway by the right kind of citizen orientation and culture. And in particular, he suggested that we needed a legally protected public sphere. That is, and this is what we spoke about last week in terms of his idea, his definition of enlightenment as the public use of reason, of people being free to argue about all uses of public authority and any other issue they want to argue about, that requires a certain structure, right? Freedom of the press, a free press, freedom of speech, and an open contest of ideas. And so you need not only legal protection, but media for mass communication, right? And here Kant clearly had in mind newspapers and books. It was a literary public sphere. And that citizens be willing to participate in enlightened and enlightening public reason. And just for a moment, because it's going to be relevant to what we do later in this class, I suppose it goes without saying that as Kant was writing in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, we didn't have television, we didn't have radio. Believe it or not, there was no internet, no cell phones. And so what people did when they wanted to engage with ideas or entertainment in their use of leisure time was to read, was to perhaps engage in discussion about what they read. And if you just think about it for a moment, how much time would you have on your hands if there were no electronic media, no mass broadcast media, no digital media whatsoever? And then how much time would you have for reading? How important would it be to you to be able to get together with friends or acquaintances and discuss what you've been reading? Kant thinks that modern republicanism requires a certain phase of historical development. And I think one of the big questions that we'll return to later in this course, Kant thought we're finally there at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. Have we superseded or overshot that phase? Has the ongoing development of our media made us less enlightened than Kant thought was required for modern republicanism to function? And I will point out very quickly the limits of Kant's republicanism, that the unpropertied are excluded from citizenship, women are excluded from citizenship. Kant was an anthropological racist. He believed in the superiority of Europeans and in fundamental distinctions between humans based on race, such that Africans and Asians were inherently inferior. And so Kant didn't get all the way there with his ideas. That's putting things very weakly. His ideas were in certain respects quite repugnant to most of us today. But having said that, I think the basis for thinking about the dignity of the individual in terms of their capacity for reason and their fundamental valuing of themselves as an end in themselves is obviously incompatible with the restrictions on who Kant was willing to grant full equal status to. And so this is one of those cases where we can use Kant to argue against Kant, and in a sense argue that although he is clearly limited by the assumptions of his time, he nevertheless articulates ideas that transcend those limits, even if he didn't appreciate it as he was articulating them. All right, so Bob and company, is Kant making more sense to you now? Are we ready to move on? Because obviously I was going to do something very brief on Kant. I expanded it to try to make sure we're all on the same page. Do you have questions or thoughts you need to?
I am ready to move on.
Okay.
With
What were you going to say?
with an unfull understanding of Kant, but whatever.
Yeah, and Bob, if you want to email me, I can try to, if you're really interested, alert you to some places you might go to get a fuller understanding of Kant, okay?
Great, thanks.
You bet. Anybody else? Onward, upward, let us hope. I'm now going to really transition out of Enlightenment epistemology, the theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? How confident can we be in what we believe? And Enlightenment moral philosophy into Enlightenment political theory. And I'm going to start by just pointing us to a document right? A document that's pretty important to we Americans, a document, as you can see, Thomas Jefferson is given pride of place in the portrait of the committee in charge of drafting the Declaration of Independence, presenting it to the Continental Congress. And this is the way the Declaration reads. And I'm going to read a little bit we sometimes leave out. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and that of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation, right? And I just want you to note how similar this is to Kant's doctrine of the public use of reason. We need to justify ourselves not to the British, not to Parliament, not to the king, but to the decent, I guess, to the opinions of mankind as a whole, right? That is our duty. And it then continues. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And I just want to point out to you, right, that in a sense, Jefferson and company, in drafting this document, distilled the enlightened common sense of political theory. And so if the American Revolution is the first of the modern democratic revolutions, it clearly flows out of Enlightenment ideas, that we have to express ourselves in a way that shows respect for the opinion of all mankind, that we are all equal, that we all have natural rights, and that government has to be compatible with those rights, and therefore itself meet the demanding standard of the consent of the governed. And I want to go further in exploring then the political philosophy that this builds on. And to do that, I'm going to start with a kind of condensed overview of democratic theory. And I'm drawing on a book here, and it's a monumental study. This is James Kloppenberg's Toward Democracy, the Struggle for Self-Rule in European and American Thought. I'm going to hold it up because I want you to see that this book is 850 pages long, and it has another almost 1,000-page file available online with extended footnotes. And so Kloppenberg has spent 20 years working on the history of democracy. And we have, thanks to him, I think one of the very best studies. And he suggests that modern democracy, as opposed to ancient democracy, is best understood as having three principles and three premises. The principles are popular sovereignty first, autonomy second, and equality third. And so again, I think the Enlightenment foundations are very clear. Popular sovereignty, of course, is an ancient idea that the people are the source of the only legitimate ultimate power in society. But it is then complemented by two ideas that are really distinctly modern Enlightened ideas that explain why it is that popular sovereignty has exclusive legitimacy as far as the modern democrats are concerned. One of those is autonomy, that each of us is capable of governing ourselves by the light of our own reason, making rules and laws for ourselves, and that human morality consists in that capacity. And so that any legitimate form of government, any form of government that a modern person can regard as not just being imposed on them coercively, but as generating genuine obligations to obey the law, has to be compatible with their autonomy. And this leads to the idea then that if you are to follow the law, you have to have a role in authoring the law. Similarly, there's an idea of equality, which you might see as implied in the idea of autonomy, but frankly, as we've seen with Kant, many of these thinkers didn't get all the way there in terms of suggesting that each person has a sufficient degree of reason, a sufficient share of the capacity to think for themselves, to govern themselves, to use their capacity for understanding to generate knowledge sufficient to make competent choices, that each of us has that to a sufficient degree to be considered an equal. That doesn't mean that there aren't Einsteins and Picassos among us. But what it does mean is that you don't have to be an Einstein or a Picasso to vote or to participate in politics. And so and it means because we are all both moral equals and equipped with sufficient reason, you can take the risk, allow people to exercise sovereign authority, and they will do it reasonably and responsibly. And then Kloppenberg separates out three premises from the three principles. The premises are more kind of social background assumptions about what is required for democracy to succeed. And his three premises are: first, deliberation, that we don't just vote on a whim. We don't just for the rest of our life vote for the party that we voted for in the first election, that we aren't purely self-interested or frenzied, passionate in the way in which we make up our minds politically. Instead, we engage in debate, in discourse. We discuss the issues of the day with people who do not agree with us, and we hear them out. We then respond to them. We listen for their replies. We try our best to be impartial in assessing the merits of our own arguments as opposed to the arguments of the other side, and then make up our minds on that basis. And what that means is that our minds can be changed over time by the argument of the other side, and that we might even over time switch sides if we come to be convinced that the other side has the better argument. And so this is a kind of cultural presupposition about the openness to engage in genuine reasoned discourse for modern democracy with popular sovereignty to succeed. A second premise is a premise of tolerance for pluralism. And this obviously grows out of the experience of religious pluralism, that we are going to share society with those with whom we do not see eye to eye on what we consider to be the most fundamental issues. And nevertheless, we are going to respect them as equal citizens, and we're going to listen to them in a process of democratic deliberation. That only works in a condition in which we say, I may sharply disagree with you about the meaning and value of life, but I am nevertheless going to concede that your perspective on those issues makes sense for you, and I need to respect you despite your differences with me. The third idea here is one of reciprocity. And here that means that I am going to, on the basis of having conceded your equality, concede that your interests matter as much for you as mine do for me. And therefore, I'm not going to propose any policy, advocate for any position that pays attention to my interests, but neglects your interests. I'm going to treat you with equal concern and respect, you might say. I'm going to show reciprocal care for your well-being alongside mine. That doesn't mean I have to love you. It doesn't mean that I have to be persuaded by your positions, but it does mean that I'm not going to disregard your essential interest just because I don't like your political position or don't think very highly of the views you defend. And having said all of that, I'm now going to go into some details, right? And this is obviously Kloppenberg's book is massive. His effort to distill what he sees as the common themes of modern democratic thinking. And I want to go into a little bit more detail in order to show how these themes grow out of Enlightenment. And so I want to talk about, if you will, two forks in modern democratic theory. One fork I'm going to refer to as a normative fork. And this starts from the idea that it's a basic matter of political right that each person is a political equal. And that for that reason, each person has to have the vote. Each person has to have some capacity to effectively express their consent or dissent from the current direction that the polity is moving in, and that consent and dissent have to be registered in the way in which power is exercised, right? And so this theory doesn't say that that's always going to go well, that's always going to result in good policy. You can think here of Alexis de Tocqueville, who famously said that democracies are mediocre. They're never going to do any great thing. They're probably not great at waging war because they don't put the best people into positions of power, that they're often going to have a lot of conformism, but there's no alternative to them. We just have to put up with the flaws and limits of modern democracy because it is the only legitimate form of government for we modern egalitarian people. There's a second fork, which I think helps to address some of Tocqueville's reservations about the quality of decision-making in a democracy. And you could call that an empirical fork. You might also call it a cognitive fork. The idea here is that because each person has a sufficient share of reason and knowledge to participate in forming collective opinion and will, and because, and this gets complicated, we'll get into this, but you may be familiar with various versions of the idea of the wisdom of crowds or the wisdom of multitudes, because sometimes, to put it differently, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that the people combined actually do things that are more intelligent than any individual would on their own. And that this is the results in popular participation giving us well-reasoned, rational public policy, that you don't have to kind of throw your hands up in the way that Tocqueville did and say, oh, well, it may be, more mediocre, less rational, less well-governed, but at least it's legitimate. The empirical fork says, no, actually, in the right cultural conditions, democracy gets us good policy too. And so each of these ideas, I think, at least to a minimum degree, presupposes the other, although they are separate forks in modern democratic theory. If you really thought that the only legitimate form of government was democracy, but that this was equivalent to signing a suicide pact, that eventually society was going to drive itself off a cliff, as you might think it's doing right now with regards to climate change, for instance, then it would be really hard to reconcile yourself to the normative argument. And if the only thing you had to say about democracy is, well, it gets us good policy, I'm not sure that that's entirely reliable, right? But when you bring these two arguments together, democracy is the most legitimate form of government. And by the way, it often produces good policy. I will just note in passing, right? We are all, I think, with great trepidation, watching what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine and what appears to be possibly an imminent invasion of a free neighboring society that is flourishing and potentially a hugely destabilizing event. I mention this now because I think part of the problem with Russia is essentially one person makes the decision about what will be done with state power. And if Vladimir Putin has become a little deranged, or if he has just become very aggressive, or if he perceives that securing his historical legacy will be enhanced by seizing another neighboring society, or if he thinks this is necessary to shore up his domestic power, he can do it on the basis of his, let us assume, deeply misguided judgment alone. Whereas in a democracy, because you have to involve many people and get many people on board, even if you have a deranged leader for a while, I assume we may think we've got some recent experience with this, there may be checks on how much damage that individual can do. That might be one essential advantage of democracy over autocracy. All right, let's start with the first fork, and I'm going to get us as far as we can, but as always, please ask your questions whenever you have them. And as you know, I can't see you, so just unmute yourself and ask away. I want to start the first fork, the normative fork of modern democratic theory, the fork that is mostly concerned with legitimacy and not rationality, by looking at John Locke again. And here I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on how Locke defends democracy. And I hope you will see by the time we're done with this, that in many respects, Jefferson is really deeply influenced by Locke's second treatise on government, as really is the whole tradition of modern democratic theory. So remember very quickly that Locke was an optimistic Enlightenment thinker, that he was someone who believed that, yes, everything comes through our senses. Yes, our senses don't give us direct access to the world. The human mind is a blank slate, but nevertheless, through slow, careful testing of hypotheses about the world, we can slowly but surely build up better knowledge about the world and come to have greater and greater confidence in our knowledge of the world. When it comes to his political philosophy, as contained in the two treatises of government, Locke starts from the fundamental law of nature, as he puts it, and that is that reason, which is that law, the law of nature. And so note here for a moment, right? that reason is the law for us if there is no government, if we are in a state of nature. Reason teaches all mankind who but will consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. And so, right, this is again this central move in modern moral and political philosophy of saying, okay, what do I want from the way in which other people treat me? Will I be happy if others take my life, damage my health, subject me so that I'm no longer at liberty, or steal my possessions? And the answer to that, I assume, is obviously not. And then you have to ask yourself the next question: is there anything special about me? Or does every other person also want this for themselves? And is there any reason, if I'm going to ask them to respect my life, health, liberty, and possessions, that I shouldn't reciprocally also do the same for them? And so that's an argument founded in reason, not in revelation, not in government and promulgated law, not one that has to be forcibly imposed on a recalcitrant nature. And so, therefore, Locke concludes that this law teaches us that we are all equal, that we all count as ends and not merely means. That, as a matter of fact, we all have a duty to assist each other if we can do so with little cost. That there is a natural right to property because we own ourselves and invest our labor in the natural world. When we do work, we then come to own the things that we have mixed our labor with. And so, before any government comes along, we are in a relatively orderly, relatively peaceable, relatively stable state of nature with property and mutual assistance and equality. And when we then ask ourselves, what kind of government do we want? We need to compare it against that baseline. And that suggests we're only going to consent to a kind of government that is going to improve our affairs. And in arguing, and I should note that Locke is arguing in a particular context. He is engaged in a heated political battle in England in the 1670s around Parliament's right to exclude the next heir to the throne if they do not consent to that heir. And the issue is that the current king has no male children, therefore his brother stands to inherit the throne, but his brother is Catholic. The Brits have had plenty of experience with Bloody Mary, with a Catholic leader trying to reimpose Catholicism on a mostly Protestant population, and they want none of it, right? And so this is the so-called exclusion crisis. Does Parliament have the power to exclude a king that it does not consent to? And in this context, Locke comes up with, I think, this remarkable and important insight into the difference between the state of nature and the state of war. Hobbes before him had said the state of nature is always a state of war, and not only that, a war of every man against every man in which every person is constantly insecure. And Locke is saying, no, actually, the state of nature can be a state of peace. It doesn't have to be a state of war. It can also be a state of war, but that's usually temporary, not sustained, not permanent. And it generates inconveniences, but not total insecurity. But it is also the case that civil society can be a state of war. And that is the state of war in which the government is at war with its citizens, its inhabitants. And that is in fact much worse than the state of war in the state of nature, even if that is as Hobbes describes it, because at least there you have a fighting chance. If it's a war of every person against every person, well, I'm a person and they're a person, right? It's a fair fight. But if it's the government with all of its power going to war with its citizens, the citizens are in trouble, right? And so for Locke, and I've numbered these boxes, right? That the most preferred outcome, the best outcome, is a civil society with peace, right? Where the government is doing only what it's supposed to do. The next best outcome is the state of nature with peace. The second worst outcome is the state of nature with war, but the worst outcome is having a sovereign government that is at war with its people, right? And so distinguishing between the state of nature and the state of war allows Locke to set up a more complicated set of choices and to indict the idea that the people will consent to any kind of government, should consent to any kind of government. They should never consent to a government that has the power to go to war against its citizens. And this then leads Locke to suggest that the social contract must be such that every person can unanimously, freely, and rationally consent to the form of government that is the government that rules them. And here the idea is not that this actually exists or occurs, but that this is a standard for judging the government that we actually have. Could it be one that we would have universally, as free and equal, rational persons, decided to occupy? If not, we have the right to revise it, and we retain that sovereign power. And not only that, again, here's a central difference from Hobbes. We don't just get to consent to government being instituted. We have to consent to its ongoing creation of law and policy. So it's not sufficient that the overall government meet the standard of rational consent. There also has to be what we might call in contemporary language a mechanism for the ongoing formation of continued consent, i.e., regular free elections in which we say we are either happy or unhappy with the laws the government is passing and their effects on us. If we are happy, please return the same people to power. If we are unhappy, let's give somebody else a try. And this then provides clear support for the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy, at least in the British context, where the king is hereditary, lifelong office, right? That person is not elected and not regularly accountable to the people. That person therefore has to be subservient to Parliament, in the sense that Parliament can exclude someone who it is not happy with, and that the king's role is only in executing the law that Parliament has made. So to take this then out of 17th century British terms and put it in general terms, sovereignty is located in the legislature, not the executive. The executive only administers the law that the legislature makes, because the legislature is diversely constituted. It contains a bunch of people, and so it can replicate the diversity present in society. It can serve as a place in which deliberation occurs, in which we are forced to hear the argument of the other side, to listen, to respond, to change our minds. And by the way, because Parliament is regularly elected, because legislatures come up for election on a regular basis, if we're unhappy with the laws the legislature passes, we can kick the bastards out. and put some new people in to hopefully make laws that are better suited to what it is we want from our legislature. I'm going to go just for another minute on these ideas because I want you to see, and this is a passage that I find particularly important. Up until now, I haven't actually read out the passages that I'm highlighting for you from Locke's second treatise, but I want to read this passage out because I think it's extremely important, and it's foreshadowing the case for the collective authorship of the law. He says, and I'm obviously picking up mid-sentence here, yet when time giving authority, and as some men would persuade us, sacredness of customs, which the negligent and unforeseeing innocence of the first ages began, had brought in successors of another stamp, and people finding their properties not secure under the government as then it was, whereas government has no other end but the preservation of property. I should point out, when Locke says that, property has a very broad connotation. It includes life, liberty, health, as well as possession. He says these early people setting up government realized that they could never be safe nor at rest nor think themselves in civil society till the legislature was placed in collective bodies of men, not in an individual. Call them Senate, Parliament, or what you please, by which means every single person became subject equally with other, the meanest men, right? No property qualification here, no basis for exclusion, to those laws which he himself, as part of the legislature or legislative, had established. And I want to leave you with that today, that Locke really is, in certain respects, already in the 1670s, 1680s, articulating quite radically democratic ideas in the crucible of a struggle over power. But he's a great enough philosophical mind that what he says, if you will, the propaganda pamphlet he writes in the middle of the glorious revolution, in the middle of a struggle for power, contains ideas that guide constitution writing and modern politics over the next several centuries. All right, I'll stop there. Who has questions or thoughts? Who wants to ask something or suggest something?
Yeah, I've got something, David. It's
Go
Ann.
ahead, Ann. Go ahead.
Why does all of this leave me so depressed? Because all of these concepts and these philosophers and these writings, in speaking in broad terms, they have a very narrow view of humanity, I think. And when all of this is imposed, and I can only think about it in terms of my own society, and I just find it very upsetting.
So, Anna, I'm not sure, and maybe you can say a little bit more. I thought you were going one place when you introduced what you were going to say, which was kind of like, whether it's Jefferson or Locke, they're writing documents in the heat of the political moment, in the middle of a battle for power, and yet they're writing such interesting, important, deep ideas. Could we imagine our politicians today doing that? And I don't think we would live up to those standards. But no, you're saying something different from that, right? You're saying that you find a lot lacking, whether it's Jefferson, Locke, Kant, etc. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what is it that's lacking? There's a kind of narrow...
They talk in very general terms about people, about humanity, but yet when you really read it, they're speaking in a very narrow section of humanity.
Okay. So Again, let me separate out two ideas here, that they
Okay.
talk in this glowing language about all of humanity, but what they really mean is male European property owners, right?
Yes.
And so, yes, absolutely correct. And yet, as I tried to emphasize with Kant, they're articulating ideas that are obviously applicable to other people, right? Besides the narrow people that they think they're applicable to. And so one of the things to say is, look, the prejudices of the moment, they were not able to escape, right? They lived in deeply sexist, deeply racist societies. They lived in societies in which ordinary people were looked down upon by educated elite men, and they didn't overcome those prejudices, right?
Yeah.
And you know, Jefferson, who writes those glowing lines about all men being created equal to the last day of his life, lived on a slave plantation and exercised severe, you might say, tyrannical control over the people on that plantation, right? And so yes, they're hypocritical. Or to put it differently, they simply accept the ideas of their time about who counts as a full human being, right? And
Yeah.
having said that, they're also articulating ideas that are clearly and absolutely incompatible with that. And Jefferson knows this. Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, tried to blame the king for imposing slavery on the United States. And the four other people who he was on the committee writing it with said, let's not get carried away, right? You know, most of them were actually not slave owners. Jefferson was, and they said, let's strike that stuff out about blaming the king for slavery. And that's not in the Declaration of Independence as a result. But Jefferson knew that slavery was an enormous crime against humanity. But he also relied on it to generate the wealth that allowed him to lead the life he led.
Mhm.
And he came from a state in which it would have been, I think, historically inconceivable to overturn slavery at that period. The whole power structure was a slave power structure. So having said that, you know, there's a contemporary historian who says we can have heroics without heroes, right? And I think one of the ways to put this is that these ideas might be heroic ideas, even if the people who wrote them were not heroes. They were not exemplars. They didn't fully realize the implication of their own ideas, or they were too hypocritical to lead their lives in accord with their ideas. And that is the complexity of history, right? If we only selected ideas from people who led exemplary lives, it would be a pretty barren landscape of intellectual history, and we wouldn't be able to account for the work that Jefferson's ideas did in inspiring Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. and a whole bunch of people in between in the struggle for civil rights and against racism, right? And so I hope this is making sense to you, that you might see this as a glass both half empty and half full. The people who authored these ideas did not draw out their radical implications and led their lives in ways that were incompatible with
Yeah.
their ideas. You know, I mean, and Locke too is a charter member of the Virginia territory, right? And so he is also implicated with slavery. But having said that, that doesn't mean that their ideas aren't part of the resources, the weapons that were used to fight for a fuller kind of equality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you for expounding on that.
I'll just say very quickly, I thought maybe you were saying something different, a third thing, which is these ideas are so rationalistic. They're so narrow. Where is the care? Where is the love? Where is the emotion in these ideas? And those are themes that we will get to later. But you might say that there's something related to what you just said, Anne, that all these ideas are written by men, and that there's a kind of masculinism to them, or a lack of emotion, a lack of genuine reflection on how human relations work. And that they're not just all about articulating ideas of obligation to each other. They're also about showing care, love, concern, nourishing each other. And those are themes that we will also get to later in the class as we turn to the political emotions. And these rationalist men are often inclined to be afraid of emotions. I think there's a sense in which we might want to democratically rehabilitate some of those emotions. Bob, your hand is up. I don't know if that's from before. Oh, I can see Marion has definitely got her hand up. Go ahead, Marion. And then Bob, if you still have a question, you can come in next.
Concerns me is thinking about your philosophers and thinking about the current situation. When we've got a nation, presumably Russia, and another nation, the Ukraine, which have entirely opposite ideas about what their rights are and what their responsibilities are. I just don't understand how the philosophy gives you any help in figuring out current political strategies. And I wonder why you're covering it at this point when it doesn't do anything for what is looking like a dangerous situation.
Well, I'll start by conceding, fair enough, that the philosophy of the 18th century doesn't help us to anticipate or solve all of the problems of the 21st century. I think that's absolutely right. Having said that, I would point out to you one of those differences between the Ukraine and Russia, and please note that these are very similar people, right? And historically, modern Russia traces its founding back to a place that's currently in the Ukraine. The language that's spoken in the Ukraine is very similar to Russian. Many of the cultural beliefs and customs of the Ukraine are very similar to Russia. And yet the Ukrainian people have elections. They have more by way of an intact rule of law. They are orienting themselves to the West and the South, to the rest of Europe. And I do think one way to explain part of the reason that they're in the crosshairs of Vladimir Putin is that they represent a kind of example, an alternative to Russia, which is to say, if we had not an autocrat, but a freely elected leader, if we had more by way of the rule of law, if we were more less an oligarchy or a kleptocracy and more open to a market economy, life might be better. And that's not a lesson that Vladimir Putin wants his people to draw from an exemplar on their doorstep, right? And so, like, I guess I am saying maybe the allure of democracy is part of what Putin hopes to snuff out if he does invade the Ukraine. Now, having said that, I started preparing these lectures really before I started thinking about Russian interference or invasion of the Ukraine. And it just so happens, and as I've said to you, like if next Friday, heaven forbid, Russia invades the Ukraine, next Saturday, that's what we're going to spend talking about. But having said that, there is a further reason why I'm engaged in this with you, which is it does seem to me that democracy is not functioning the way in which the people who generated the tradition, the institutions, the ideas that we draw upon thought it was going to behave. And so figuring out what's gone wrong with democracy, not by looking at contemporary partisan competition or growing inequality or racism, things that we've talked about extensively together recently, but instead by looking at human nature as such. That's my aim. And maybe I'm spending too long on the philosophy. Maybe you're saying, hurry up and get to the psychology and the cognitive science, and we are getting there. I'm doing my best to keep Bob happy, who wants to have a good understanding of Kant, to do what I think is necessary in terms of understanding the genealogy, the history of democracy. And I'll just hold it up again. You know, I'm not going to go through every of the 850 pages of Kloppenberg's book, I promise you. But I did want to give you enough of a picture that we could set up then the critique that comes out of contemporary understandings of human psychology, rationality, cognition. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And thank you, Marion. It's a genuine concern, I know. Okay, Bob, go ahead.
I just wondered if you could give a brief position on what you think about the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court, which is saying that a corporation is a person, whereas everything that we've been talking about, we're talking about really individual, you know, one body, one heart, one person. And it seems to me that that is quite antithetical to what we've been discussing here.
Yeah, so there are some technical reasons to view corporations as legal persons for at least certain reasons, holding them liable, for instance, when they do harm. But having said that, to think that the fact that they are legal persons means that they therefore are entitled to freedom of speech, to a kind of freedom of speech that is equivalent to the freedom of speech that real persons have. That freedom of speech is protected by protecting essentially unregulated spending on electioneering, right? I go back to Kant's idea of the public use of reason, and the idea that what the public use of reason requires is an equal argument that is deliberative, in which each side gets to hear the other side and respond to the other side's reasons and arguments. And it seems to me that that decision is so discordant with all of these other ideas. And that part of the problem is the way in which the First Amendment functions in our society as a kind of absolutist principle. And there's a long jurisprudence around this, but frankly, that's not the way it functions. The idea of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press function in many other democratic societies, as opposed to a value that is a constitutional value or genuine right, but that has to be balanced against other rights. And so the 14th Amendment has an understanding of equality built into it and due process. And one question is, if you give corporations full political personhood, if you interpret speech as spending, what's going to happen to the equal capacity of all citizens to influence how power is exercised? We will be drowned out by corporate megaphones, corporate spending. And I think the subsequent history shows that. And I think in many respects, it was a naive political decision. I'm sorry, a naive judicial decision that suggested it would be anything but. We definitely, I think, can use the principles articulated by Locke and Kant and Rousseau, and to look ahead a little bit, Montesquieu, to suggest that was a bad decision. And so not everything that's done in the name of democracy is valid. Not everything that's done in the name of democracy reflects a rich and reasoned understanding of how democracy works. Does that help a little bit, Bob?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, everyone. We've gone way over again. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you're having fun with it. I'm open to feedback. If you have any, please feel free to email me or pass it along through Amy. Otherwise, we will continue and be moving out of the Enlightenment and into the counter-Enlightenment and out of the counter-Enlightenment and into contemporary theory over the next few weeks. Be well, take care, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks for being with me today again. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, David.
You, David.
Yes, bye-bye.